Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the decolonization of British Africa after World War II. Now, you might think of it as a pretty straightforward story, a fight for freedom against an empire. But the reality, well, it was a lot more like a complicated partnership, a kind of political double act that would go on to shape the future of an entire continent.
And that gets us to the big question for this explainer. Who was really in the driving seat? Was it the British administrators carefully managing the end of their empire and controlling the pace of change? Or was it the African nationalist leaders forcing the hand of their colonial rulers and seizing their own destiny?
So, here's our game plan. We'll set the scene right after the war, then we'll look at the British guys on the ground and the nationalist leaders they were dealing with, then we'll get into a really fascinating twist on the whole story before we wrap it all up. Okay, let's get into it. To really get a grip on decolonization, you have to picture the world right after 1945. I mean, everything was changing, and the British Empire was sitting right in the middle of this massive global shift. The war was a total game changer. You had this new generation of educated African leaders stepping onto the stage, and they were hearing all this anti-colonial talk from places like the US and the Soviet Union. Ideas like Pan-Africanism were connecting people across borders. But the biggest thing? They were just fed up with Britain's vague promises about self-rule. The pressure cooker was on, and it was about to hiss. And this wasn't just talk. Things started happening, and they happened fast. Boom, 1957, the Gold Coast becomes the independent nation of Ghana. A few years later, 1960, Nigeria follows. Then 1962, it's Uganda. This wasn't some slow, planned-out process. It was like a set of dominoes toppling right across the continent. And for the British Empire, well, this was a whole new reality. The so-called men on the spot, their administrators on the ground, were suddenly not the ones dictating the terms. A lot of the time, they were just scrambling to keep up, forced to move way, way faster than anyone back in London had ever planned. So let's zoom in on these British officials. Who were these men on the spot, really? And how on earth did they handle the pressure of basically managing the end of an empire? This right here is absolutely key. That phrase, immense discretion. What historian Caroline Elkins means is that these colonial governors weren't just puppets getting orders from London. Not at all. They had a huge amount of power to make their own calls and shape policy right there on the ground. But having all that power was, let's just say, stressful. I mean, just imagine it. You've got impatient nationalist leaders demanding action. You've got vague, unhelpful instructions from your bosses back home, and you're constantly worried about making one wrong move that'll embarrass Britain on the world stage. It was a political tightrope walk, for sure.
And as you can see, there was no single playbook for this. Each governor had to improvise. In Uganda, Sir Andrew Cohen tried for a slow, gradual approach, but it completely backfired, and he ended up deporting the local king. In Nigeria, Sir John Macpherson tried a new constitution, but it just fanned the flames of ethnic rivalries. But then you get to the Gold Coast, where Sir Charles Arden Clarke tried something totally different.
And this is just a wild story. Arden Clarke makes this incredibly bold move. He takes the main nationalist leader, Kwame Nkrumah, straight out of a prison cell and brings him into the government to work with him. It was this stunning, unlikely partnership that, against all odds, really did smooth the path to independence for Ghana. Okay, so we've looked at the British side of the table. Now let's flip the coin and look at the other half of this double act, the African nationalist leaders. And it's really easy to lump them all together as one unified group, but the reality was a lot messier. The end goal was crystal clear. Everybody wanted independence, but how to get there? And, more importantly, who would be in charge when they did? That was a whole different story. They all agreed on the destination, but they were all arguing over the map. And this quote from the historian Nicholas White just turns everything on his head. He points out that for a lot of these leaders, their biggest rivals weren't the British. Nope. The trickiest hurdle, as he puts it, was often other nationalists who were competing for that top spot. Ghana is a classic example of this. You had Kwame Nkrumah pushing for one unified country with a strong central government. But he ran into massive opposition from powerful groups like the Ashanti, who were worried about losing their regional power and demanded more local control. So all this internal conflict, all this rivalry, it brings us to a really key historical debate, a fresh way of looking at this whole process that might just change how you see things. Here it is, again from Nicholas White. What if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if decolonization wasn't really a struggle against colonial rule, but was actually a struggle for who should rule once the British were gone? That one little tweak reframes the entire narrative, doesn't it?
So think about what that meant. If you're a leader, like Nirmama, and you're trying to overcome these powerful internal rivals to stop your future nation from splintering into pieces, what do? Sometimes you make a very pragmatic choice. You team up with the British governor, the very symbol of colonial power, to secure your own position and hold the country together.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? After all that complexity, who really was in the driving seat? Well, it turns out nobody was. There wasn't one single person or group with their hands on the wheel. It wasn't a clean victory for one side over the other. It was a messy, complicated, and often tense negotiation. It was that double act where British administrators and African nationalists both ended up shaping the transition together, often because they simply had to. So here's what you need to remember. First, individuals mattered a lot on both sides of the aisle. Second, those British governors had to be politically agile and think on their feet. Third, the nationalist movements were rarely, if ever, a united front. And finally, remember that the struggle was often just as much about who would rule the new nation as it was about ending colonial rule itself. And that leaves us with one final thought. If the foundations of these new nations were built through these kinds of partnerships, these messy compromises, and these internal power struggles, what does that tell us about the independence they actually achieved? How did this double act end up shaping their future?